first a brief introduction and then some of the aspects of managing sows in groups, perhaps a little repetition, hopefully some newer information on space allowance, pen design, grouping practices, a bit more on floor design, and then I'll get into mixing times, early versus late mixing for sows. So as I'm sure you're all fairly aware by now, I don't have to go into a lot of background on this, looking at the increasing regulation of gestation housing, and certainly starting in the EU with 2013 stall use just being permitted up to that 28 days. Netherlands now I think stall use only up to 5 days, so just covering the breeding period. UK and Sweden, there's a total ban on stall housing. And in Canada, we've got a group housing is mandatory in any new barns or renovated barns. That started in 2014. And in 2024, any sows that are still in stalls will have some additional restrictions or requirement for periodic exercise. And certainly in the USA, we see stall use being restricted now in 9 states and potentially others going forward. And as we see this, producers are seeing this, and production companies see these changes. There are a lot of voluntary changes, and in some cases, some incentives potentially, depending on your brand and your packer, for sows in stalls or with other welfare standards. But then we anticipate that these demands will be ramping up in the future with increasing packer and retailer demands for sows being managed in groups. So yes, in Canada, I'm managing a project there where I'm following producers, so lead users who are going into groups and looking at how they're doing it, what it's costing them. And this is actually a free access ESF system, so a system in addition to those that Ashley described that kind of combines some of the features of a free access stall with an ESF system. So that's a newer system that we're seeing quite a lot of now in Canada. And actually this is their one of their earlier stall designs, and they've been going through various iterations for that free access stall precisely for some of the reasons that Ashley mentioned, too many moving parts. And so now their latest design has a completely hinged system, so it's all one piece. The piece that goes in front of the sow is a hinged mechanism, so with just one working part. So trying to reduce that the number of moving parts on these free access type stalls. So yes, I'm working, this is a producer in Ontario, a small producer who's using the NEDAP system, and he quite appreciates this heat detection unit with the bore for finding any repeats in his system. Anyway, very nicely managed barn, again with the NEDAP ESF system. This is a producer who's using a competitive feeding system with groups of 18 sows per pen, and a trough fed, a mash feed falling into water in the trough, and he's delivering two feed drops per day there. But he's not necessarily satisfied with that system and is looking at some alternatives to that right now because he doesn't like some of the aggression that he's seeing in this system. But from my perspective, it's working quite well. And then, yes, this is another ESF system that I'm working with in Ontario. So yeah, I really have a nice opportunity to work with a lot of different systems here and see how they've implemented them and how well they're working. Details on these systems can be seen in, I've got a website, groupsowhousing.com, that has some more details on this. But I will say, just as a warning, if you're working with producers or you are a producer, one barn that recently did a renovation in Ontario, they hired a short-term technician to help in an additional facility where they moved some sows during that renovation. And this worker was actually doing some undercover video for an animal rights group. So in this transition, you know, they made a quick hiring decision, and that turned out to be a mistake. And certainly it has been reviewed by the local pork group organization, as well as the SPCA. And yes, there were some changes in terms of use of blunt force trauma and training of staff. But yeah, no welfare implications were found in the videos, but certainly it's something to watch out for when you're in this kind of transition phase and maybe bringing in new staff. So again, talking about the management of these systems, we've got the system factors, the feed system that you choose, which I think Ashley went into some good detail there. Space allowance being also a main factor, the actual design of the pen and how that could be used potentially to reduce mixing aggression. And then the actual management practices for the group, the large versus small, static versus dynamic, uniform versus diverse parities, and that timing of mixing. So I'll get into some details on some of these areas. So first of all, space allowance, I'd say this is one of the most important areas. And if you're doing a renovation, it's very important to kind of consider what can be accomplished within the existing barn space, and can that same barn footprint be used for the same sow herd? And certainly the experience there is that providing too little space is definitely a negative in terms of your productivity of sows. There are some studies on the different space allowances, and clearly 16 square feet per sow is too small. 24 square foot is sufficient. There is not a lot of clear data about what happens in between those space allowances. I've got here the EU guidelines, which are quite adequate. Certainly, they are recommending 18 square feet for gilts, which is the figure that Ashley also mentioned. And for sows in Europe, the lower limit of space allowance is 24 square feet per animal. Then they've also got some contingencies there on the number of sows per pen. So in groups of less than 6 sows, they require 10% more space allowance to allow for sow interactions. And then in groups of greater than 40 sows, you can have 10% reduced space due to the space sharing efficiencies that can be achieved in those larger group pens. And our new Canadian Code of Practice, it doesn't have requirements on space allowance, but it does have a table of recommendations, which is I think fairly solid and is kind of a compromise between that EU standard and a more practical standard. So here's the recommendations in our recent Code of Practice in Canada for minimum floor space allowances. So we've got values here, say for a partially slatted system of 15 to 18 square feet for gilts, 19 to 24 for sows, and then for mixed parity groups, 18 to 23. So as you see, it's not a one value, it's a range of values. And by and large, we would again recommend that for those smaller group sizes, you go with the higher end of that range, and with larger groups, you can usually go towards the smaller space allowance. So I think that's a very helpful and very practical guideline in terms of space allowance. There has been some research on this, and Lee, are you here? Yes, you are. So this is a study that Lee Johnson and Yushi Lee did, looking at sow production, comparing stalls to a floor feeding system, I believe. So they took a barn with a specific space footprint, and they wanted to look at converting that to groups and using that same footprint, so they're not reducing the number of sows that could be accommodated. So they had sows that remained in stalls. Large pen groups were formed with the 26 sows per group. So 13 pens were taken out on each side of the alleyway to give a pen of 26 sows, and smaller pens were also formed with 3 stalls per side of the alley. And as you saw previously, In the Smithfield barn, where they did a similar kind of change, they actually did reduce the sow number in the room from over 500 to 400 and some. But in this kind of design, you would be able to manage the same number of sows, theoretically. So here's the results, production results from that study. So looking at the weight gain in stalls during gestation, 41.5 kilos, large pens only 33 kilos, and small pens 39. Farrowing rate, again, a drop in that large pen situation, and a high removal rate in that, again, in that large pen system. And specifically that these removals in the large pen situation were due to NIPS or mortality. So clearly there were some impacts on productivity, but there were no effects on actual litter size. So I think it's very important to do this kind of research, because people talking about moving to groups, it's often just postulated. We could just pull out the stalls and form these group pens. However, I think this data is necessary to kind of emphasize why that's not a good option. So clearly, due to the removals, we can see that sow welfare and performance were reduced in groups. And again, I say this is highlighting space allowance. That 16 square foot per sow is really too low. The competitive feeding, so it was a floor feeding system. And these groups, I do not believe, were sorted by size and parity. Is that correctly? Yeah. So I think the staff were not properly prepared for this. So if you're going to make this transition, it's important that staff be aware of the management system. And I think they were largely skeptical and unprepared to go with groups. So you can see the impact of going to just those group pens. And I do think it's very valuable information to have, and it highlights some of the reasons that we're describing to you today about how sows should be managed in groups and the reasons for that. So clearly, yes, our scientific studies show that more space is better than less. In general, sows require not just the physical space that their bodies take up, but they also have a social space. They need space to move out of the way of other sows when it's required, and to perhaps actively avoid aggression from a dominant sow. This study by Wang et al., 1998 study, showed that there was less aggression and injury when sows were kept at 26 instead of 21 square feet. So again, that emphasis that more space is often a positive thing. But then when we look at the practical aspects of pork production, we can't give sows unlimited space. We have to find that tipping point above which sows may experience adverse effects. So first you may see these behavioral issues of increased aggression, but going beyond that, you may see the increased dropout rate, sows failing to maintain body condition, or aborting and failing to maintain a pregnancy. So that's our objective in research, is to find out what is the ideal, and it's going to vary depending on your group size, your feeding system, and your pen design. So as I say, we've talked about some of these basics of space allowance. Then of course we've got to consider feeders and drinkers, the ratio and placement of these things. The layout of the pen, so providing an avoidance distance if possible, which is possible in the larger group pens, in which case partitions are also valuable in terms of allowing sows to isolate themselves from others, and also providing for the separation of dunging areas, feeding areas, and resting areas. So if sows can kind of set those areas up in a pen and use them properly, you're going to have much fewer issues in terms of aggression, and you'll see sows resting and feeding in a very good, positive way. So looking at the aspects of pen design, it's been suggested that pen design is as important for reducing aggression as pen space is. So what aspects of pen design? As I say, partitions are very valuable in this case to divide the pen space and provide sows with options for isolation. Certainly in large group dynamic pens, sows will form cliques of their sows that they're more familiar with, possibly the group that is moved in with them. So providing partitions in these bedroom areas allows them to isolate themselves and form their own cliques within a large dynamic system. The flooring, certainly the provision of some solid lying areas is a very positive thing. Nice if they have a slope to them, so you've got some drainage and less potential for manure buildup and less scraping required. And this is always also going to encourage the correct use of alleyways. So by providing a solid bedroom area, sows are going to be attracted to lie in that area more so than in an alleyway, and you're going to have better flow of animals through the pen, again, more specifically in a dynamic or large group situation. There isn't a lot of research on slat and gap width or the orientation, preferred orientation. We do have a project that's ongoing now with the University of Manitoba and Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada looking at the orientation and slat and gap width specifically. I don't have the results of that right now, but certainly the EU standard recommends 20 millimeters, so 4/5 of an inch being the maximum gap width. And we do have a number of barns that are using this and successfully have very, very clean pens and fewer problems with dew claw issues and toes getting injured in the crack. But yes, we do expect to have some more data on that coming up, and I'll be documenting this on our study farms as well. And there is also some interest in alternative flooring materials, such as the use of rubber mats, which can potentially improve leg and foot health, but certainly it's a great boon to the dairy industry, but much more challenging when you place these things in front of a sow, which is going to actively root them. So the best option there, certainly some European barns I've been in have been using rubber mats, but they're also providing, say, a high fiber forage, say a straw rack, in addition to the rubber mat, so there's something else for the animal to interact with and attract them beyond the rubber mat. Another thing that we've seen more and more use of is these slat gap covers. There's different varieties out there, but basically they can be used in a slatted system to fill that gap and create a solid flooring area where previously it was slatted, so that can provide more leg and foot comfort to sows. And the beauty is that if you find that that's become a dunging area, you can remove those slat gap covers in that specific area or adjust them as needed without the cost of pouring concrete and having to live with concrete after you've poured it. So a nice flexible option just for trying out different solid areas. And enrichment, certainly providing enrichment is now a requirement of our Canadian code, so we're looking at different ways of providing enrichment to pigs of all ages in the barn. Certainly it's known to encourage positive behaviors and to reduce aggression and negative behaviors. And then also the benefits, certainly in gestating sows, of increasing the satiety can also influence or reduce aggression. So we're doing some work now looking at 2x4s suspended on chains, or there's other designs that would say have a metal holder on the wall that you can just put in a 2x4 and sows can chew on that, and yes, it provides quite a good enrichment. And certainly the tried and true is chains, and that's, I would say, would be better than no enrichment, and does provide attraction to sows. And we're doing some experiments now looking at ad lib provision of fibrous feeds or including it in the gestating sow ration. So experiments now going on at Prairie Swine Center looking at pelletized straw, different procedures for pelletizing straw so that it can be transported and moved and stored in a convenient way, more so than loose straw. So here's some examples. This was a Danish barn, again showing some of the partitions. So in Denmark now they're often using short partitions instead of a 4-foot wall, a 2-foot wall. And it's easier to see what's going on in the pen, and certainly sows are still attracted to use these partitions. Also a straw rack over a solid pen area. And this is a liquid manure system, partially slatted system. And they have found that there's very little straw that actually gets in the pits, and so they are able to provide straw in a rack and provide some fiber and enrichment that way. Again, this is a barn in Ontario. It was converted from stalls, and so he's got some quite narrow alleyways. More ideally, I'd prefer to see an 8-foot alley width for sows to move around, so that if there's a sow lying in the alley, they're not going to be blocking flow. But certainly in this system, because he's poured a nice solid bedroom area, sows much prefer to lie in the designated bedroom areas, and so he's managing quite well, even though these alleys are quite narrow. Again, yes, this is he's still got the original floors from his gestation room, and just poured a cap in certain areas to cover the previous feed trough area. So that's the gilt pen. So yeah, strategic use of some solid flooring there to actually make the system work better. So again, here's some other enrichment ideas. A simple straw rack made out of rebar. And this is a short concrete wall. This is a rack holding a 2x4. And then this is actually a feed line chain that's being suspended here, and yes, you can see they've chewed the plastic off of it. I'm not sure if that's an approved feed ingredient, but or where that plastic ended up. That's actually in a barn in Quebec. So yes, a chain is I think now they're just using chain there instead of the feed line chain, but that's another alternative. And here's a picture of our prairie swine herd. So we've got free access ESF, which is in our perspective as a research barn, very convenient way to manage sows in terms of providing different opportunities for research. We can simulate a stall housing system and provide different feed types to sows, or we can again manage sows in groups. And in the tea pens, we're experimenting with different enrichments in the tea pen area. And this is one of the preferred enrichments here. A chain with a 2x4, and so yes, sows can push that around, and then once the 2x4 gets worn down, it's quite easy to replace. A few comments here on group size, and certainly with the smaller groups, we see that as much more common with the competitive feeding systems, typically from 10 to 30 sows. It's very convenient for the producers that are using it because you've got nice static groups. They're the same stage of gestation, unlike those dynamic systems where you need a sorter and you've got to be able to find the sows that need to go to farrowing or that need to be vaccinated at any specific time. So there's certainly a lot of convenience in these smaller groups. And you can also select sows specifically for these small groups, so you can form more uniform groups of similar size or parity or back fat body condition. And certainly in the competitive system, that element of uniformity is much more important because the sows have similar feed needs and they can compete equally in the group for that. With the larger group sizes, certainly this is more common, as you know, with electronic sow feeder systems. And certainly you can't form very large groups with a competitive feeding system. You're just, the largest I've heard of is 40 sows, and that's in a very complex pen design so that there's multiple areas where feed can drop. But certainly that requires very good management. But with larger groups, say anything from 45 to over 300 sows per group, you can see animals adopting a much more tolerant behavioral response in terms of interacting with other sows. Some work that was done at Prairie Swine Center in 2009, we looked at groups of 18 or 108, and that was grow-finished pigs per group, but then mixing those animals back into either small groups or large groups for a 2-hour period and observing the aggression. And certainly the study there demonstrated that in a large group, animals adopt a much more passive response. It's much like humans in a big city. There's not much point in trying to interact with every human that you meet on the street. Whereas in smaller groups, yes, everyone knows their place in the social order and respects that. And certainly, again, just in terms of a large group, if you're a dominant individual, the energy that's required to dominate a much larger group is much too high, too labor intensive to dominate all the other individuals in a large group. So you do see a very different adoption of a different social behavior. And again, with these large group systems, with electronic sow feeding, we can provide individual feeding. And so you can mix different parities within the group. However, even in these larger group systems, it's still recommended to keep gilts separate because they are a special case unto themselves. So even in our large dynamic herds, you'll often see a separate pen for gilts, for low parity sows, and for high parity sows. So here's a few of the points for reducing aggression at mixing. As Ashley mentioned, it's going to happen anyway, but there are some things we can do about it. The timing of mixing may influence it, how you form that group. So what is the social experience of the sows before they go into groups? We expect that in the future we'll be developing gilts specifically for a group housing situation. Some experiments done in Denmark involved mixing gilts multiple times before they went in their final group pens. And this provided them with that experience of mixing with different sows and taught them to adopt a more passive response, because often another study that we did in Illinois showed that the gilts were actually the most aggressive individuals. They were troublemakers, and I've watched this in some of the videos we've taken. A gilt will go up to a mature sow and bug her until she gets a response. So yes, if gilts have that experience of multiple mixings, they can learn to adopt a much more passive social style. Static versus dynamic groups, very different, and then uniform versus diverse parities, again, depending on your system and how you're managing it. So yeah, some questions were raised about the use of odors. Certainly, some producers are using mixing pens in terms of physically managing that mixing group. If you've got a group that's going into a large dynamic pen, it's often beneficial to form that group before they go into the large dynamic group. So if you have a mixing pen where these sows of a similar gestation state can become familiar before they go into the large group, that can be beneficial. And as I said, the pen design. So yeah, full feeding before they're mixed is one way of helping to reduce aggression. There are numerous studies that have tried to look at ways of using odor to reduce aggression. And I've seen people anecdotally using baby powder and say introducing a boar, sometimes a vasectomized boar, to the pen to kind of influence aggression. But the data on use of boars is mixed. Some people have seen an effect, others have not. So I suspect it's a very mild effect, if any at all. no effective odors, but an older study did show that anosmotic sows, so sows that had their sense of smell ablated, so did show less aggression, but there may have been confounding factors there, and certainly we don't. Most animal care committees don't approve those kind of studies these days. So still some interest in this factor, but I have not seen anything that's effective. Time of day has been suggested as a factor for reducing aggression. So if you say full feed sows, as you mix them and then mix them late in the day, the suggestion is that they'll eat and go to sleep. But the data shows that when they wake up, they still go through that mixing aggression to work it out. So the time of day, it may appear to be beneficial in those first few hours, but they're still going to work out that aggression. So coming to the point of when to mix. Certainly we know that aggression is going to occur when sows are mixed, and this is a potential for injury and lameness. If sows were not bred, it could disrupt estrus expression. The stress could impact the conception rate or your litter size. And we certainly recognize that implantation period of 1 to 4 weeks is a very sensitive time for mixing. So there have been suggestions on what could be a successful time to mix, either right at the weaning, so forming a group directly from farrowing, as is now mandatory in some of those European countries, or they can be mixed shortly after insemination, or as is most common here right now, after implantation, so 28 to 35 days or even longer, as in the case of Smithfield's practice. Certainly in Canada right now, the code has the 28-day limit, but then you're allowed an additional week to allow for mixing of groups. So we have a 35-day limit on group housing for mixing sows. So looking at the option of that 4 week after breeding mixing, so this is, as I say, the most common practice. So mixing after confirmation of pregnancy. So this is a very convenient way of managing sows. You can use stalls for that period to manage your breeding and implantation. So you've got a close eye on individual sows. They're in stalls, and you can monitor estrus. You can monitor feed consumption. You can bring up their body condition while they're in the stalls. And they're in a convenient place for breeding and preg checking. And then that mixing aggression is delayed until after the implantation. So yeah, we can clearly see there are positives to this practice. But we're now seeing that there may be a potential impact of this practice on pigs in the prenatal environment. We've seen actually some advantages, as I'll go into later, on a slightly earlier mixing time. And then there's, again, the continuous question of what if stall use becomes more restricted? What if we are limited even further on our use of stalls? So that's one reason why we performed this study, just looking at the different options. So the next option would be mixing right at weaning. So certainly if you mix sows directly from coming out of farrowing, their aggression is going to be resolved before they come into estrus, so no issues around affecting implantation. There's some evidence that early mixing may help to bring sows into heat, so that social excitement of that mixing could help shorten your interval, and then that sow-to-sow contact could even help to synchronize estrus expression. However, there are definitely some clear concerns around this practice. Certainly estrus behavior, that mounting, could lead to injury and lameness. Again, depending on your flooring quality, that's definitely a concern. Mixing aggression could disrupt that return to estrus. There's some suggestion that subordinate sows may inhibit or have a silent estrus in a group situation like that. And then there's the practical side of it, the added work of say, finding a stall to move those sows into, and then boar exposure. How do you manage that when sows are already in a group? Mixing after insemination. is the other option. So in this case, your mixing aggression is ideally resolved before the implantation, so shortly after insemination. And one attractive side of this option would be that it saves on barn space. If you're doing a renovation, you don't need as many stalls. You can convert more of that stall area into group pens and be more efficient in your use of barn space and have a higher sow number in that same space footprint. However, you have to note that mixing really needs to take place quite shortly after the insemination. So ideally within 5 days. Lee and Ganyu did a study published in 2013 where they mixed the sows at 8 days after insemination, and certainly they did see a drop in the farrowing rate by 5%. So if you're waiting to that 8 days, you've missed that window, and you may affect your farrowing rate and reduce your productivity. Also, there's some added work involved in preg checking in pens, because now the sows are already grouped in their pens by the time you should be preg checking. And certainly the groups that are using the ESF systems, there's often a heat detection unit that is available with that, and groups are using the ESF heat detection unit quite effectively to identify any repeats. So that is certainly helpful. And I've got one barn saying that, we barely really need to do preg checking because this heat detection unit is telling us if there's any repeats required. So yes, we do see in practice that more and more farms are going to this mixing after insemination and finding that it is quite effective. So getting into the study that we did, looking at mixing times at Prairie Swine Center, the first study we did is looking at these 3 treatments. One was an early mixing treatment where the sows were mixed directly at weaning. The other one was a late mixing treatment. So this is our control treatment and what we typically do in our barn, where sows are mixed within 35 days after breeding. And we also included a pre-socialization treatment, which involved mixing the sows at weaning for a 48-hour period to familiarize sows, and then putting them in the stalls for breeding and remixing that same group at 35 days. And the idea behind that pre-socialization group was that yes, we would familiarize sows, when they're not pregnant, and get them habituated. And then ideally, when they were remixed at 35 days, you would see less aggression because they were already familiar. But in actual fact, we saw the repeat of the aggression, the early aggression happening again. And then after those 4 weeks in a stall, yes, they didn't really seem to have much memory of themselves, of each other. And yes, the work was done in collaboration with Yushi Lee at the University of Minnesota at our barn and Prairie Swine Center. So this is the layout of our pens. So they're set up for a free access stall system. In this case, we used only 14 sows per pen so that we had sufficient space in this open area. We combined both gilts and mixed parity sows because we have a fairly small herd, and our weekly breeding groups include both mixed gilts and higher parity sows. But with the free access stall system, we don't find any problems including gilts in our groups. So by including only 14 sows per group, we had a 24 square foot space in between the stalls here in that loafing area. And in this case, we used the feeding stalls only for feeding time. So in the morning, sows were allowed in and allowed to feed. And otherwise, the rest of the day, they were moved out and locked into this open area. Otherwise, they would be obviously probably spending a lot of their time in the free access stalls, and really not a good representation of group housing. So yes, we recorded quite a lot of data on these sows. We looked at videotaped their behavior at mixing. And in the early mixing treatment, we looked at sexual behavior after mixing. So any mounting. We observed their body condition and injuring scores. So body condition, body weight, back fat, and this was done at 3 time points. We did skin lesion scores and gait scoring for lameness, both before and at 48 hours after mixing to look at any impact of aggression. And then we did typical sow productivity measures. And then, actually the only results that we saw significant differences were in the conception rate and the farrowing performance, as I'll show you. So this was some of the aggression data at mixing. So we have the early mixing, the pre-socialization, that first mixing of the first 48 hours after coming out of weaning, and then the late mixing group. Certainly no differences in the frequency of aggressive events on those days 1 and 2 after mixing. No differences in the percentage of time spent in aggression on either day 1 or both combination of days 1 and 2. So yes, same levels of aggression. Salivary cortisol levels. Certainly here we have a baseline measure. There were no significant differences there. We also collected at 24 and 72 hours after mixing. And in the case of the pre-socialization treatment, yes, they had the 2 mixing events. So sampled after that first mixing and after the second mixing. And yes, so this was a subsample of sows, so 24 animals per treatment. And yes, no significant differences between treatments. But as I say, in terms of conception rate, we did see some differences. And here we saw that the early mixing treatment had the highest conception rate, 98%. Late mixing treatment, as I said, was our typical and control treatment, only 87% conception rate, and that pre-socialization treatment, 94%. So that was a bit of a surprise to us that the late mixed sows had a significantly lower conception, but we did do a few different things to them in terms of we used those free access stalls as their stalls instead of the stalls in the breeding room, and so yeah, there may have been other factors impacting them there. And there were no differences in returns to estrus or sow removals across the treatments. In terms of their performance, basically no difference in the total born alive, or mummies, but we did see a significant difference in the stillborn pigs. So significantly, and again, 0.95 pigs per litter compared to 1.54 or 1.58. So it's not a huge difference, but it was statistically significant with our 84 sows per treatment. So that was an interesting difference that we saw there with fewer stillborns in that early mixed treatment. And this has also been shown in some other studies looking at early mixing. So initially we thought maybe it was because sows are getting exercise in group housing, that they're perhaps having some data shows that the birth interval of sows in groups may be shorter because they're fitter and muscle tone. But certainly all these treatments were in groups. So there's something specific here happening with that early mixing treatment that we hope to investigate further. So our main conclusions from this study was that certainly under that Prairie Swine Center conditions, we didn't see any effects of that early mixing treatment on sow performance. And certainly prairie swines sows are all are put into those feeding stalls. So there's no competition for feed. So we didn't see any of that aggression that you might see in other feeding systems. So certainly, a very controlled group housing situation. There was no effects on performance, and somewhat better conception in that early mixing and pre-socialized treatment. So possibly a clearer estrus expression and more pronounced heat. And certainly, anecdotally, any gilts that were in that early mixing treatment, none of them cycled, none of them repeated, whereas we did have repeats in both of these other treatments, which was an interesting observation, but I haven't really analyzed. I don't know if there's enough data really to provide a good analysis. Fewer stillborn piglets in those early mixed sows, so potentially we are seeing some benefits of early mixing although, as I say, it's a more labor-intensive procedure of managing sows in a group while you're breeding. So basically, I think the take-home message from this work was that that is a very positive one for producers in terms of the ability to select the option that suits their system. It could reduce space requirements if you're going to that early mixing treatment. And certainly we have a trial that's concluded now, but we just have to do the analysis that included a mixing post-insemination treatment, which is, I think, the treatment of greatest interest to producers. And yes, especially combined with some more automated heat detection, I think this is a very strong option for producers in the future, and we'll have that data shortly. But our initial impression is that yes, it worked very well with the sows being mixed by 5 days after insemination.